Today, we're looking at something I think a lot of our listeners are super interested in, and that's fusion energy.
Absolutely.
And specifically what's going on in China, because they're really pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
Their experimental reactor, East, which is setting some pretty crazy records.
Yeah, breaking records.
So let's try and get a handle on this.
Okay.
Where does China stand in this whole race for fusion power?
Right.
What are some of the challenges they're facing?
Yeah.
And is this really going to be the future of energy, or are we still kind of in sci-fi land here?
Yeah. Well, the future is now, right? I mean, that East news, that's the big one.
Yeah.
Holding plasma stable for over 1,000 seconds.
That's insane.
It's a really big deal.
And this superheated plasma is just chilling there, contained. Yeah. It's wild.
It really is.
So what's really fascinating to me is that this isn't just like a national win for China.
Right.
This East reactor is part of this big international project, ITER.
Yes.
It was all about trying to prove that fusion power can actually work on a massive scale. Right?
Exactly.
So they're pushing boundaries, but they're also sharing knowledge, feeding back into this global effort.
Absolutely. Collaborating.
It makes you wonder, right? Are they playing the long game? Like, are they using ITER to get ahead later on?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
It's a smart strategy for sure. And this kind of leads us right into talking about CFETR,
okay,
which is their next generation reactor. And it's going to build on everything they've learned from ITER.
So is this where China goes solo and really tries to, become the dominant force in fusion?
It's possible. I mean, CFETR is a big deal.
Yeah.
It's got two phases.
Gotcha.
Phase 1 is all about stable operation, running continuously. And then there's this idea of tritium self-sufficiency.
Tritium self-sufficiency.
Which basically means breeding more fuel than it uses.
Wow.
And they're going for 200 megawatts of power output.
200 megawatts? That's enough to power a small city.
Exactly.
We're not talking about lab experiments anymore. This is getting serious.
Yes, this is the real deal. And then phase 2. Phase 2 is even wilder.
Oh, wow.
They're prepping for what's called a demo reactor, a demonstration power plant.
Okay.
Full-blown power plant. They want to hit over a gigawatt of power output.
A gigawatt? That's enough to power a major city.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now I'm starting to see why you said the future is now.
Yeah.
A gigawatt of power from fusion, I mean, that's not just changing the energy game, that's changing the world.
Totally.
But I got to say, the Wikipedia article, it does list a bunch of challenges.
Yeah, of course.
It can't be this easy, right?
It's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
It's important to point out that China actually has 3 other fusion test reactors.
Okay.
Up and running right now.
Okay.
So HL2AM in Chengdu, JTEXT in Wuhan.
Okay.
And of course, East. We're all paving the way for CFETR. But even with all this experience, there are huge hurdles ahead.
Like what's the biggest thing standing in their way?
Well, I mean, everything matters. Location, resources, infrastructure.
Okay.
CFETR is going to be built in Hefei, same place as East, but there are 19 key problems that they need to solve.
19 problems.
Just to make the thing work.
It sounds like they're trying to build a spaceship, not a power plant.
It's pretty complicated, yeah. I mean, things like controlling plasma instability and keeping impurities out.
Right.
Those are just 2 of the 19 problems.
Oh, man.
And then you've got the issue of tritium,
Okay.
which is one of the fuels for fusion, but it's incredibly rare.
Oh, so how are they going to fuel this thing if it's so rare?
Well, that's where this tritium self-sufficiency comes in.
Right.
They need to breed tritium inside the reactor
Okay.
by bombarding lithium with neutrons.
So they're creating their own fuel while the engine is running.
Essentially, yeah.
That sounds like a challenge.
It's next-level engineering.
Yeah, it's not just building a reactor. It's building a whole fuel production system alongside it.
Exactly.
Crazy. But I got to ask, with all this complexity, is it even economically viable?
Right.
I mean, renewables are getting cheaper all the time.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
You're hitting on something really crucial there. Fusion has always been this expensive, futuristic option.
Yeah.
So to figure out if it can compete, we need to look at something called levelized cost of energy, or LCOE.
Okay.
And it compares the lifetime costs of all the different energy sources out there.
Okay.
Construction, operation, fuel, you name it.
So is fusion just doomed to be too expensive?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Fusion plants, they do have high upfront costs,
Right.
but the fuel is cheap and it's abundant.
Okay.
And they think the running costs are going to be lower than traditional nuclear.
Interesting.
So it's a long-term bet.
Yeah, like an investment.
Exactly.
So it is a gamble.
Yeah.
A gamble, but with a potentially huge payoff.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of reminds me of those early investors in the internet.
Right. Right.
Super risky back then, but look at where we are now.
Absolutely.
But speaking of risks,
Yeah.
what about the safety side of things?
Right.
Because fusion, it's nuclear.
It is.
Even if it's supposed to be, cleaner than fission.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Safety is paramount.
Yeah.
One of the challenges they're facing in China
Okay.
is that they don't really have specific safety rules for fusion yet.
Oh,
They're
interesting.
kind of working off of the fission regulations,
Uh-huh.
but those aren't a perfect fit.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, right?
Exactly.
And to run into some problems.
Yeah,
And what about that tritium stuff? That's radioactive, right?
it is.
What if there's a leak?
Well, that's definitely a valid concern.
Yeah.
Tritium handling is critical.
Yeah.
I mean, a major release.
Right. It could be disastrous.
Yeah.
Potentially requiring evacuations
Yeah.
and long-term contamination. But CFETR is being designed with this idea of a no evacuation criteria
No evacuation criteria.
in mind. Yeah.
So they're basically trying to make it so safe
Yeah.
that even in a worst case scenario,
Right.
people wouldn't have to flee.
That's the goal.
That's pretty ambitious.
Very ambitious.
But it shows how seriously they're taking the safety aspect.
Yeah.
Like they're really trying to
Absolutely.
design those risks out from the start.
Right. Right.
But even with the best engineering,
Yeah.
there's still the question of waste, right?
Of course.
Because fusion isn't totally waste-free, is it?
It's not.
What happens to all that stuff that gets irradiated inside the reactor?
Well, it's interesting. Fusion waste is actually less radioactive per kilogram than fission waste,
Huh, okay.
but you can end up with more of it overall.
Because of the neutron bombardment.
Exactly. Yeah.
So less dangerous stuff,
Yeah.
but more of it.
Potentially.
What do they do with all that?
Well, some of it becomes low-level waste, which is, relatively easy to handle.
Okay.
But then a lot of it will be intermediate level,
Right.
which requires, longer-term storage,
Yeah.
more stringent protocols.
So they're trying to be as responsible as possible, but waste disposal is still a hurdle, it seems like.
It is.
Okay, so after hearing about all these challenges, I'm wondering, are they still on track with that crazy timeline we talked about? 2035 for the prototype and 2050 for commercial use. Is that realistic?
Well, you got to remember that East breakthrough we talked about.
Yeah.
That wasn't just a win in itself. It was a huge sign of progress for CFETR.
Okay.
Because they're both in Hefei,
Right.
using similar technology. And that 1,000-second plasma confinement, that's a massive confidence boost.
So East is like a mini CFETR, proving that the concepts actually work.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then don't forget HL2M.
Right, the one they heated up to like 10 times the sun's core temperature.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And its success also really suggests that CFETR construction is probably already happening.
Wow, so they're not messing around.
No, they're not.
So 2035 for the prototype, still on the table.
It's still their target, yeah.
Okay, what about commercial use by 2050? Could that actually happen?
Well, it's still their target, and you have to remember this all fits into China's bigger energy strategy.
Right.
They want to be carbon neutral by 2060.
Yeah.
And they're really rapidly scaling up their nuclear power capacity in general. I mean, 79 gigawatts by 2025.
79 gigawatts, that's a lot.
That's more than double the entire U.S. nuclear capacity.
Wow.
So fusion is just one piece of their plan to become this clean energy powerhouse.
Right, it's a huge undertaking.
Absolutely.
But there's more to it than just domestic energy,
Well,
right?
absolutely.
There's got to be geopolitical implications here, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I think this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What happens to the world if China actually pulls this off? Fusion power on a commercial scale? I mean, that would be a game changer.
It would change everything.
Yeah.
Imagine a world where China doesn't need to import oil or gas anymore.
Right.
They've got energy independence.
Yeah.
Very few countries could match that.
That would shift the balance of power completely.
It really would.
Countries that are reliant on fossil fuel exports, they'd lose a ton of leverage.
Absolutely.
And China's influence would just skyrocket.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're playing a whole different game than everyone else.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it raises some pretty big questions. Will other countries try and, sabotage their efforts?
It's possible.
Will they try and steal the technology?
Could happen.
This could spark a whole new kind of arms race.
Yeah.
But instead of weapons, it's about clean energy.
Exactly.
That's a fascinating thought, but also a little bit scary.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder, what happens to the rest of the world if China becomes this fusion powerhouse?
Right.
Do they share the technology or do they hoard it for themselves?
Yeah.
Do they use it to help developing nations leapfrog dirty energy sources, or do they use it to, exert dominance?
Right.
Those are some big questions.
Those are the million-dollar questions.
Yeah, and it's not just about energy independence either, right?
No, it's not.
I mean, access to cheap, clean energy could reshape everything.
It could.
Economies, global alliances, even military strategies. I mean, it's hard to overstate the potential impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about.
It is.
We've gone from a record-breaking plasma experiment
Yeah.
to potentially reshaping the geopolitical landscape. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah, the stakes are high.
And it all kind of hinges on whether China can pull this off,
Right.
actually achieve what they've set out to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bold vision.
It is.
But if they succeed, this isn't just about China anymore. The whole world changes.
So let's play that out, all right? say it's 2050.
Okay.
Fusion power is commercially viable in China.
Right.
What does that world look like?
Well, for starters, I think, for countries that are really heavily reliant on fossil fuels, think oil-producing nations, their influence would diminish rapidly, I think.
Okay.
The economic and political power that they wield today.
Right.
It would just erode.
As the world transitions to a new energy source.
That they don't control.
That they don't control, right?
Exactly.
So a decline for the old guard and China rises to the top.
Potentially, yeah, but it's not just about winners and losers.
Right.
Fusion could be a lifeline for developing nations.
Okay.
The ones that are struggling with energy poverty.
Right.
Imagine if they could leapfrog over fossil fuels entirely and build their economies on clean, abundant fusion power.
That's a much more optimistic scenario.
It is.
Instead of just shifting the balance of power, it's like it levels the playing field.
Exactly.
It gives everyone a chance to thrive.
Right, and you can't forget the impact on climate change.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, fusion power could be the key to decarbonizing these industries that are really difficult to electrify.
Okay, like what?
Steel, cement, even long-haul transportation.
So we're talking about a complete transformation
of
how we live and work.
Absolutely.
The cars we drive, the cities we build, everything powered by fusion.
It's a whole new world.
It's almost overwhelming to think about.
It's a paradigm shift, no question about it.
But it also raises some ethical considerations.
It does.
What happens if this technology falls into the wrong hands? Could it be weaponized?
That's a valid concern.
And then who gets to access this, this clean energy future?
Right.
Will it be shared equitably? Or will it just make existing inequalities even worse?
That's something we have to think about.
Yeah, those are questions we can't really answer today.
Yeah.
But they're questions we need to be asking. Because the future of fusion power, it's not just about the science and engineering.
It's bigger than that.
It's about making choices.
Yeah.
About shaping the world we want to live in.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Well said.
It's powerful technology, potential for immense good.
Right.
But also potentially devastating consequences.
Yeah.
It all depends on how we use it.
It really does.
Yeah.
To our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of fusion.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And China's bold ambitions, it's complex.
It is.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
And at times, even a little bit scary.
A little bit.
But it's a conversation we need to be having.
Absolutely.
So keep exploring, stay curious.
Yeah.
And let's see what the future holds.
Absolutely.